Well, welcome to the prize session in Applied Micro. We have two amazing papers. We have an hour and a half, so probably what is the best course of action here would be a half-an-hour presentation of each paper and then 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Let's start with more than words. I think it's Nicholas who is presenting.
Yeah, I'm presenting.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Let me.
So I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes left, okay?
Okay, so I have 30 minutes approx, right?
Yeah, 30 minutes, yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So thank you very much for letting me present our paper here. This is a joint work with my two colleagues, Thiago Cavalcanti and Daniel Damat. Now let me start straight with the research question, given that we don't have a lot of time. This paper basically tries to answer one kind of specific, but I think interesting question, which is if leaders with their words and with their speeches and with their exemplar, good or bad exemplar behavior can actually trigger a behavioral change among the citizens and in particular among their followers. Now, in particular, in the context of this paper, which is this pandemic, what we try to answer is basically if, during these times, those leaders, or in this case, this specific leader, that again try to use his persuasive power to convince people or to induce people to comply or not comply with the social distancing recommendation if he was successful or if he was not, right? So basically that's the idea. That's the idea of the paper. Now the context of the paper is as you know, Brazil. And there are many reasons why we think this context is suitable. It's a suitable context to answer these type of questions for many reasons that you probably know better than myself. And this is the slide that we typically use for non-Brazilian audience, so it's not that relevant. But there's one point that I would like to emphasize, which is this last point, which is that Brazil is quite, and I think one of the reasons why this context is particularly suitable, which is that Brazil is quite a federal country, and it's a quite federal country, in particular in this context, in the sense that almost all the non-pharmaceutical interventions and lockdown types of policies and so on, they were basically implemented by the local governments. I mean, by the subnational, the state government. And this is important because this means that if the president or if the federal government wants something else to happen, meaning if he wants to counteract these lockdowns or induce people to restore normality and so on, well, there's not much that he can actually do, right? So there's not much that he can actually do besides what he has been trying to do since the beginning, which is basically using his words and his speeches and his persuasive power to convince people to kind of restore normality and so on, and this is exactly what he has been trying to do since day one. So these are just a few examples that you probably remember very well. These are two very controversial, very prominent events in which President Bolsonaro again undervalued the disease and tried to induce people to restore normality and so on. And these were, again, so these are just two examples. These were particularly prominent. They even reached international media. You may remember, this is just Financial Times, but you may find things like this in The Economist, Washington Post, and so on. And this because, at that point, in March, end of March, this was quite controversial. Now, to be honest, this has been happening since day one, right? So it's not the case that he, suddenly changed his speech and suddenly started to become, against isolation and so on. So this is something that happened almost continuously since day one, and this is important because this presents an empirical challenge, right? If we wanna test the effect of Bolsonaro's speeches or Bolsonaro's words or actions on people's behavior, then we need to find a way to identify those events that were particularly salient or particularly prominent because this was happening since day one. So in order to do that, what we do is we try to implement the most agnostic or systematic approach that we could think, which is basically following this idea by this paper of Titera and Francischelli in the Age Apply in 2011, which is basically building what we call, or maybe they call, I don't remember, a news coverage index, right? So what is a news coverage index? Basically, it's our way to identify the most prominent events of Bolsonaro against isolation and undervaluing the disease, which is basically measuring the size or the area or the proportion of the front pages of the newspapers in which Bolsonaro was, explicitly and actively, again, speaking against isolation policy. So this is an example of how we build our index. We took basically the top 4 newspapers in Brazil. Again, for robustness, we do top 3, top 5. It doesn't change much. We chose top 4 basically because after top 4, it drops, very, very drastically. But this is what we do. So for example, this is March 25th, and this is Folia. So again, so we manually, of course, with help of other people, with students and RAs, we manually classified basically the front pages, right? So identified that this one was Bolsonaro clearly speaking against isolation. Then we measure the size of this, and then we measure the size as a proportion of the total front page, right? And we do this with all the top 4 newspapers. We average them out, and we get something like this. Okay, so basically this is our news coverage index that goes from 0 to 100. Well, it could go potentially to 100, or in that case, it would be 100% of news of Bolsonaro against isolation. And as you see, there are a couple of events that seem particularly prominent, that seem particularly salient, that are basically these two, right? So basically these are. Okay, so these are these two, March 15 and March 25th. You probably remember this very well because, again, this was quite prominent and quite controversial back then. This was the march, the protest of March 15. There were many, in the basically all around the country, and I don't know if you remember well, but a few days before this, Bolsonaro actually was on TV with his former Minister of Health. And he literally, the Minister of Health literally suggested not to attend these meetings, and Bolsonaro actually agreed because it was kind of a bad idea. And nevertheless, he went to the meetings. He, did everything that was unrecommended, taking selfies, touching people and so on. So this became very controversial. This even went to the international news. And this is March 25th, which is one of the public pronouncements. He had like 5 or 6 public pronouncements in this time. This one was the only one that actually reached very easily all the front pages, and this because this was the time in which he actually explicitly urged governments to open up the economy and the schools and so on. I think this was the time he talked about the gripezinha and so on. So this was again one of the most prominent events, and this is what we see in the data, right? So in a way, the idea is to show that after these events there was a significant change. These events trigger a significant change in compliance with social distance. Right? Now, just to show you that this is not just from front pages, let me show you a couple of additional pieces of evidence, basically consistent with the relevance of these two events. These are Google searches, so these are 2 different Google searches. One about Bolsonaro pronouncement. Again, he gave quite a few, but this was by far the one that was more prominent. And the same with manifestação, with protest. Again, there were quite a few protests, small, big protests, in the country. This one was the only one that was particularly prominent. And the same with Twitter, right? So Bolsonaro and his sons, they tweet a lot, right? So they tweet a lot, and what we did is we downloaded all the tweets of Bolsonaro and all his sons that have Twitter, and we basically created this index of Twitter likes. And again, it's clear that there are 2 days that are March 15 and March 25th that are especially prominent. Right now, again, this is, if you take a look to this day, he basically tweeted like 47 videos of different protests all over the country. So this doesn't seem to be very strange. Anyway, we are going to use, so we're going to use this as a way of identifying, the kind of the discrete events here, but we're also going to use this index to test if there's some kind of intensive margin effect using this as a continuous variable. But basically the idea of this is to use a kind of systematic way of identifying the most important events of Bolsonaro against isolation. Okay, so that was the first part. That's just basically trying to identify the most prominent events. So let me very briefly describe the data that we're going to use. I'm going to describe the most important piece of data. Then there are a few additional things that are not so relevant. So I'll focus on this. The most important outcome is basically social distancing. We measure social distancing using an index that we take off the shelf from InLoco. InLoco is a company that share the data with us. Basically, what they do a lot of things, but they have access to mobility data of more than 60 million cell phones in Brazil. The way this works is the following. It's not that you have to install an application of InLoco or something like that. No, basically their clients are apps. So when you are in Brazil and you install whatever iFood, then you're probably going to give permission for this app to share data, for example, within InLoco. So that's how they know where you are. It's obviously anonymous. And what they do with this is they build an index of social distancing, which is defined as the proportion of mobile phone devices that remain within a certain radius of 450 meters from the cell phone house, right? So what is the cell phone house? Is basically where the cell phone spends 7 hours, continuous 7 hours during the night. Okay, so that's basically the definition. Could be, you could think that this is a bit arbitrary, maybe it is, but this is the way they define it, okay? So even if it is arbitrary, it's not our cherry picking, right? So we just take the index of shelf. This is the index that they use when they work with governments. It is what it is, but it's not our decision. So this is how the index looks like. This is pre-pandemic, and this is during the pandemic. So this is April, and this is February. More intense red means that there's more social distancing, right? So more phones stayed at home. Obviously, there was all over the country there was an increase in the social distancing index. That seems natural, but then there's a lot of heterogeneity, right, across municipalities, and what we claim is that heterogeneity is not random. It depends on things like the one we are studying. So that's one piece of data. Then the other important piece of data is electoral data. So we use we have to define we have to classify municipalities in terms of pro-Bolsonaro or anti-Bolsonaro. We do this using the 2018 voucher for the president. We use different definitions just for robustness. I'm going to mention just a few. In one, which is actually the baseline, and I'm going to explain why, we define that a municipality is pro-Bolsonaro if the vote share is above the state median. In another one that we also use, and I'm going to show the results, we say that a municipality is pro-Bolsonaro if he got more than 50% in the first round, and then we also run some regressions with the vote share as a continuous variable. Now, why do we like this particular measure, and why is that our baseline measure? Basically because of this. So this is the vote share of Bolsonaro in 2018. As you see, there's a clear regional divide, to the point that if you take this measure, which is the one that it seems natural, you have a lot of states that are completely pro-Bolsonaro or completely anti-Bolsonaro, right? So these states is completely anti-Bolsonaro, and this state is completely pro-Bolsonaro, right? There's no variability. All the municipalities here, he got more than 50%. Right? And that's problematic because most of the policies were implemented at the state level, right? And this means that if Bolsonaro speaks, and then there's a there's a policy that was at the state level influenced by that speech, then we would be capturing that because we will have a lot of within state variability. And we're not very. That's not particularly problematic because we control for that. But what is more problematic, and we cannot control for that, is if actually there's, for example, a change in enforcement, right? So it's not that the governor changed the law or the regulation because of Bolsonaro's speech, but maybe he changed the enforcement. Right? And we really need to have, it's better to have some within state variability, and that's the reason we do that. Anyway, we're going to show the results with every definition. It doesn't change much, but that's the one that we like the most. And finally, you're also using data on consumer spending. Again, if you believe that people stayed more at home or less at home, depending on as a result of Bolsonaro's speeches and so on, then you should also observe this in terms of economic activity, right? You go out more, and then you probably spend more, and so on. So basically, we want to show this, and to do this, we use data from one of the largest banks in Brazil. They have market share of credit cards of more than 1/3 of the operation. So it's quite a big bank. We use basically data on in-person and online transactions of credit cards. Just to give you an idea, of course, this is not representative because it's just one bank. Again, it is what it is, but it correlates quite well with central bank data, aggregated data on credit card transactions, right? So basically, this is our data and the aggregated data at the country level, and it's very much correlated. So again, it's not completely, so it's obviously not representative, but it seems to replicate fairly well what happens at the national level. So that's basically the data that we use. So let me very briefly tell you what is the identification strategy. We do a lot of robustness checks. I'm going to show some of them. So let me first explain the main equation that we are using. So basically, it's a two-way fixed effects with leads and lags at the day municipality level. So it's quite simple. What we have is social distancing measures at the municipality day level. We have day fixed effects, municipality fixed effects, a couple of municipality day time varying controls. In particular, what is important is that we control for policies that obviously change by state and by day and so on. And then this is the variable that we care about, which is what we call treated, which is basically a variable that is going to take a one if two conditions are fulfilled. First one, that municipality in particular is defined according to one of our definitions as a pro-Bolsonaro municipality. And also if in that particular day, we identify that Bolsonaro spoke against isolation. So these two events that we identify. So the event in the baseline specification, the event is going to be defined as basically it's a 1-0 variable that will take a one in these two days, which are these 2 days that I show you at the beginning. In an alternative definition, we are also going to use the index, the news coverage index, just as a continuous variable. Okay, and this is the baseline. Then we do a lot of things. I'm going to show you some of them, but this is basically our baseline specification. So let me show you some results. This is again with the most, with the basic specification. These are the placebo, the pre-treatment events that are basically 0. This basically says that there doesn't seem to be, at least the days before the events, there doesn't seem to be a very strong, parties are dividing social distancing, with drastically changes after 1 day of the event, and this remains like that for a couple of days. So these are the confidence intervals with 90% and 95% of confidence. We put them together, and in terms of magnitude, this is around 2 percentage points, and the mean is around 30%. So just to give you an idea of what is the magnitude of the impact. So this is the baseline result. Again, I'm going to show you just a few of the robustness checks. Then you can take a look to the others in the paper, but there are a few that could be important. So one is what happens when we change the definition and take, instead of above state median, we just take above 50%. The result is quite similar, a bit more noisy. Maybe we lost significance in a couple of events here, but the pattern seems to be quite consistent. Even in terms of magnitude, it's not very different, around 2 percentage points. So that seems to work. What happens when we use, instead of defining the events as 1-0, we use a continuous variable using just using the news coverage index as a way of measuring the intensity of the speech as a continuous variable. We find a quite similar result. Again, a bit more noisy. Some of them are not significant over here, but it seems to be the case that in general the pattern seems to hold. Now the interpretation of this, again, you have to. This is a continuous variable, so this is the intensity margin. But in terms of magnitude on average, it seems to be quite similar to what we find here. Okay? Changing the clustering at the state level doesn't seem to change anything much. So basically, we find exactly the same thing. All of this seems to be significant in every case, and at 90%. In most of the cases, at 95%. So it seems to be quite robust. Okay. We do a couple of additional things to convince you that this is actually what we are identifying. One thing that we do is we run this kind of placebo test. Basically, we coded with a 1 every event in which there was a public pronouncement of Bolsonaro, in which he speak about, many times he also actually spoke about the pandemic, but not so prominently and so on. And we basically use that as the treatment to show that nothing happens, and indeed nothing happens. So basically, other Bolsonaro pronouncement doesn't seem to be very relevant. The only one that was actually relevant was the one that he actually actively and explicitly spoke against isolation. Okay, so all right, so that's so far. Again, so main result and some robustness that are particularly relevant. There are a couple of things that could be problematic if some assumptions are not fulfilled, in particular because we have two events that are very close in time, right? So basically we have one, I mean, there are basically 10 days of difference between these two, and unless certain assumptions are fulfilled, then this could be problematic. I mean, there's not like a unique thing to do in this case. So basically we explore the literature and try to, add robustness checks, doing what others do to try to show that this is not problematic. So basically there are two ways of basically trying to solve this problem. One is just to ignore the subsequent events. So you take just the first event, and then you take the second one is just, you just forget about the second one as if it never happened, and you see if the shock still persists. So this is one thing what we do. And the second one is a bit more kind of, let's say, agnostic or more systematic, but it's just estimate the dynamic diff in diff and just estimate the the interaction between the each time effect, each period effect, and the support for Bolsonaro, and see what happens every day with mobility, and just interpret the graph. So we do these two things. This is the result when we ignore subsequent events and we take only the first event. Again, obviously it's not exactly the same, but the effect seems to be seems to be negative, obviously with a bit more noise, and some of the periods are not significant, but overall the pattern seems to be very similar. Okay, so this is the first solution to the problem of having two close events. The second solution, as I said, is just estimating a dynamic diff in diff. So basically we took all the days of our sample, which are basically 74 days, that are the days that we got, for which we got the data, and basically, interact each time effect with the support for Bolsonaro dummy at the municipality level. So this is basically the pattern, right? So again, this is a bit more difficult to interpret. That's why we don't love this graph, but in a way it shows a similar pattern to what we saw before, right? So this is the again. So the interpretation of this is the difference in mobility for each day between pro and anti-Bolsonaro municipalities. So again, before the first event, there was no difference. Basically, this is almost all zero. Then there's a kind of sudden drop after the first event that happens immediately after the march, and that's what you see over here. These days are the days after the march and before the public pronouncement. And then this is the second event, right? So you have the second event in which Bolsonaro, mobility was already down, right? Differentially down, so was So basically the effect was already there, but then there was an additional event, which was Bolsonaro's pronouncement, and then you have an additional drop in the mobility that you can clearly see over here. Okay, so this is again a way of trying to show this in a more kind of agnostic way without having to make too many assumptions about the model, given that we have these two very close events. Okay. All right, so I think I have I don't know, probably 10 minutes or something like that. So I'll try to finish with the last part of the paper. So
you actually have 5 minutes, Nicholas.
5 minutes. Okay. Okay. Well, I have 5 slides, so that's okay. So basically, so far I talked about mobility. Okay, and that's the main point of the paper. But there are a couple of additional things that are interesting. One of them is what I said at the beginning about credit card transactions. So if we think that mobility went up, then the other side of the coin is that if mobility goes up, then economic activity should go up in comparison to the municipalities, to the anti-Bolsonaro municipalities, and we test this. We test if these effects that we see in terms of mobility also replicate in terms of economic activity, and basically what we do is we run the same regression, but using in-person and online credit card transactions as the main outcomes. Okay, so this is exactly what we do. For robustness, we exclude pharmacy. it doesn't change much, including or excluding pharmacy, but we exclude it because that could be due to other reasons. And this is what we find. Okay, so these are credit card transactions in person and online. This is daily expenditure per capita. I'm not sure exactly what is the, yeah, so it's daily expenditure per capita. Again, nothing happens before the events, then there's an increase, sudden increase that persists in terms of economic activity in person, not so much online. Okay, so again, this seems to be consistent with the other pattern in which we also observe an increase in social mobility in the pro-Bolsonaro municipalities. Okay. Yeah, so one thing about this, which is also, I think it's in terms of interpretation, it is important. I mean, you could think again, so you could think that mobility, people, in pro-Bolsonaro municipalities, they started to go out more, but just to do essential things, or going to the park or taking a walk or so on. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, they were going out and they're actually having, a more normal life. I mean, they were spending money. Now let me go to the last part, which is trying to explore what is driving the results. Again, so this is just suggestive evidence. I don't want to oversell the results, but I think they provide some interesting patterns. We basically explore three kind of channels, or three kind of things that we think that could be driving the results. One is the role of traditional media. What is the role of social media, and what is the role of what we call organized support? So what is traditional media is basically try to understand if in places in which there's more presence of local media, then the speech basically is magnified, and therefore the effect is larger. So basically, we do something quite standard. We count the presence of TV broadcasters from this data set, and we classify municipalities as with some presence of no presence of local TV broadcasters. With social media, we do something similar. We couldn't get, for computational things, we couldn't get like previous Twitter activity in Brazil. So what we did is we live streamed tweets in Brazil, in the entire country, for a week approximately. That would basically download all the tweets every 20 minutes. Okay, so we got this number of tweets, and then we created this indicator classifying municipalities as high activity, high Twitter activity, or low Twitter activity. So that's basically the indicator. And finally, what we call organized supporters is the proportion of evangelicals living in each municipality. And the reason is that, I mean, first, because one important reason is that basically among evangelicals, Bolsonaro won by 72%. So that's like it's important group. But more importantly, during the pandemic, if you remember, evangelics were quite, or some religious groups of evangelicals were quite supportive of Bolsonaro's policies. So in a way, we could expect to see that in those places in which there's some kind of organized supporters, then the effect could be larger. So basically, we classify again as above or below the median of proportions of evangelics. So let me very briefly show you the three results. This is what happens with TV broadcasting. So this is in municipalities where there's no local TV broadcasters, and these where there's at least one TV broadcaster. The effect seems to be completely driven by these places. This is what happens with Twitter activity. These are places with no or low Twitter activity, municipalities with low Twitter activity, and municipalities with high Twitter activity. So again, the effect seems to be almost completely driven by these municipalities. And finally, what happens with evangelicals, it's quite similar, right? So basically in places with high presence of evangelical parishioners, the effect seems to be larger, which we think makes sense because the place in which you have more organized support of the press. Okay, so I think my time is out. So let me finish with the conclusion. Basically, the idea of the paper is to give this message, above and beyond institutions, regulations, policies, incentives. There seems to be an important role for the persuasive power of the leaders through the words, actions, and their exemplar behavior. So that's it. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and great timing. Now we open the floor for questions. If you have a question, just unmute yourself and you can ask directly. Let me start then. So one thing that I thought was very interesting is this sharp response, even, when you go at the national level and, at the state level, I think you controlled for some variables, but there are some governors that were pushing back, right? So I was wondering if you have some analysis or anything to say about, especially populist states where the governors were pushing back, like São Paulo, for example.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. No, so we that the short answer is we haven't. I mean, we didn't take a look to that. One thing that we were trying to do, we never fully implemented is what happened when what you said, right? When governors speak, right? So what happened when there's a speech of so you have the speech of Bolsonaro and the policy of Bolsonaro, and then you have governors saying some other stuff. So you may expect some effect of their own speeches. But honestly, we finally never implemented that. So but that's a good point. Yeah, this is something that we should definitely take a look. By the way, I think my co-authors are here, so please jump in.
Okay.
Anytime. Yeah.
So there is a question in the chat. Is there any analysis of the effects of Trump's speeches about COVID-19?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a systematic paper. I mean, I don't know, but it's a good idea. So if there's not, you could try.
Yeah, Trump's speeches, I don't know, but I think there is for rallies. But that's
absolutely.
Naturally goes for the rallies. Any other questions?
Yeah. Francisco, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Super interesting, but like just to try to understand how to interpret your treatment. You said about persuasion. How should you think about social media? Because in the case of Bolsonaro, he has a social media. He has basically a direct channel of communication with his followers. That's WhatsApp. And I imagine that the timing of the communication through his own, let's say, social media with the timing of this public speech are very synced. So how do you think this kind of the president influencing people through the media as this persuasion, as you said, or it's just like the political leader calling his own people to the street, kind of tocando o berrante?
But what is what would be the difference between one or the other one? So one
because
would be...
one, you are not influenced, like you have your followers and you will just give the sign, go to the street, this is a hoax, and go to the street. So you're not persuading people. They are already persuaded, they are on your side, and you just ring the bell. And the other is more this, like, I'm the president, I give the example, and I'm persuading my citizens to a behavior. Do you see?
Yeah. So I get the point. What you're saying is basically there could be two ways of thinking about this. So one thing is you don't have all the information, and then you receive the sign out from the leader, and then you say, okay, maybe it's not a bad idea to go, and now like in a Acemoglu's paper kind of thing, right? So you receive the signal, and then you learn what is the right thing to do. And the other thing is, I mean, you're just following what the leader says, and it's not that you're solving an informational issue. It's just a kind of, yeah, that's a good point. We don't know. so it's not easy to disentangle these two. And this is something that we thought a lot about that, but it's not easy, right? Because I guess you would need some kind of, you would need some kind of, lab experiment. So there's a lab experiment trying to do something like that.
Cool.
But yeah, no. So the short answer is both things could happen, and we cannot disentangle these two. And I think it's quite interesting, but quite difficult to separate.
Okay.
So Nicholas, just to say something here, your evidence on the evangelicals suggests that it's the first of Chico's hypothesis, right? Like, because if they were the group supporting Bolsonaro at a higher, rates, and you see that is like those municipalities are the ones where the response actually happens.
And they are organized support, right?
Exactly. So it might be suggestive of this the first hypothesis that Chico mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, we take that as
It
very
doesn't make less interesting. It's just trying to understand like the
absolutely. No, absolutely.
Yeah,
And that, I mean, any idea would be great because that's something that we have been trying to think a lot, and it's difficult. No, I mean, that's a good point. Yeah, if you think that evangelics are basically organizing, kind of a mass of people, then yes, we take that as very suggestive in the sense that, obviously the presence of evangelics correlates with many things, right? So it's not, I mean, but yeah, no, that's a good point, and there's something that.
Actually, very interesting paper as well. My comment was exactly about the evangelicals, because I think there's one particular difference between the two events is that the first event happened on a Sunday, March 15, like the first weekend that like people really got serious about about COVID. And there's probably, like churches were probably open that day. So, I think if you want to really investigate the evangelical influence on this as like organized supporters, I think you should disentangle the effects between the two events. I think the first event is probably much more I mean, the evangelical influence could be much stronger. The other thing is like, can you actually measure the proportion of people that go to churches? I mean, you have like mobile phones, right? So you have like you can georeference all these addresses of churches in these municipalities. I mean, this can take a lot of work, but that could have some information there, like the type of social distance related to going to evangelical churches.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We should request that data. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get it, but that's a good point. About the first thing that you said, yeah, that's true. But actually, if you so we thought about that because maybe you should expect something to happen the other day, right? So you have the protest all during the day. That was Sunday afternoon and so on, and nothing happened when you drop, for example, Sunday, or when you take the first day after, the first Monday as the day zero. It's basically the same thing. So I don't know if that changes that much, but it's a good point about finding data on going to churches. That could be very, very interesting. So yeah, we should request that data.
So Enrique Rodriguez has a question. Can you please just unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes. I just unmuted myself. So Nicholas, one quick question. I saw that you're using municipalities, but I have a feeling that you could do something even more granular, because electoral data in Brazil, you can find it in voting booth level. So you could use that. I'm not sure about your social distancing measure. Could you have something more granular? So like a municipality neighborhood or something like that, because then you would have even more precise estimates.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the thing is, for the mobility data, we got more granular data only for a very few, I don't even remember so probably Daniel knows the name, but for smaller units, but for just a few. So it's because we thought about that, but yeah, it's so the mobility data is not for the whole country, and it's actually just for a few parts of some states. So it's not very great. And the other problem with that is that when you start to reduce the size of the unit in which you measure mobility, measurement errors become larger, right? So it's at a very small level. They even start to drop some data because you need some minimum level of cell phones. So it becomes very hard. Again, we have some data for very specific places, but it's not really enough for the
And we have for 3 municipalities, only 3.
So yeah. So but yeah, it's a good point.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
All right, so if there's no more questions, let's give a round of applause, a
Very
virtual
good paper.
applause for
Congratulations.
Nicholas and co-authors. This is a great
Thank you.
paper. So let's then move to the next presentation, which is going to be, if I'm not wrong, by Pedro. You can share your screen. Pedro, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, so I'm having difficulty to share the screen.
Okay,
I think you have to give me the permission.
Okay, whomever is from the SBA helping, can you please do that, or can I do it myself? Let me try doing myself.
I'm looking here. Pedro.
So, yes,
Pedro is not listed as co-host. I think you have to put him as co-host, actually.
Yeah, but I cannot do it. Can whomever is from SBA, quem tá aí da SBA para nos ajudar?
Oi, Edson, sou eu, Diogo.
Oh, Diogo, de novo, você pode colocar o Pedro como co-host, porque ele não está conseguindo share the screen. O Pedro Molina. Isso, muito obrigado.
Pronto, Pedro, tenta agora, por favor.
Ótimo.
Ok, agora acho que foi.
Okay, 30 minutes then, Pedro. Take it away.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Pedro. I'm a PhD student at São Paulo School of Economics, and today I'm going to talk about labor unions and the electoral consequences of trade liberalization. I'm writing this paper with Emanuel Ornelas from São Paulo School of Economics and Rodrigo Soares from NISBER. So let's get started. Let's talk about the motivation. Well, trade exposure and trade policy have become central topics in the political debate lately, especially after Trump's election, the Brexit, and the ongoing trade war between China and the United States. And indeed, there are some studies in the economic and political science literature showing that trade shocks can have important political consequences. Some of these studies show that trade exposure is related to the punishment of incumbents or reduction of votes for the ones who implement the trade policies. Trade exposure is also related to gains for parties identified with protectionist policies or parties identified with the labor movement. And also trade liberalization is related to political radicalization. However, those responses have been typically interpreted as individual-led reactions motivated by economic concerns. So the idea is I lose my job because of the liberalization, then I want to vote against the incumbent, or I want to vote for a politician identified with protectionist policies. Okay, this is the idea behind these studies. But in our study, in this paper, we first confirmed that trade shocks can have large political impacts in both short and long run. But we also showed that this effect seems to be mediated by institutional changes caused by liberalization and not only individual reactions. Okay, so what exactly do we do in this paper and what do we find? Well, first we conduct an analysis at the micro-regional level, which its definition is similar to local labor markets, okay? So we conduct this analysis to evaluate how Brazil's liberalization that took place in the early 90s affected presidential elections since then. And first, we showed that regions of Brazil most affected by the liberalization has also experienced a permanent reduction in the support for the left-wing presidential candidates when we compare with the less affected regions. And this result is kind of puzzling for a number of reasons. First, it was a center-right party, the one who implemented the reform. And second, the left is historically identified with the labor movement in Brazil. So if you consider an individual reactions that commented before as the punishment of incumbent or ideological reaction to the reform, like the support for parties identified with the labor movement, we should have observed an increase in the vote share for the left and not a reduction. Okay, so it seems that our results kind of different from the previous findings in the literature. It seems that part of the story is missing here. So how do we explain the results and what's the mechanism driving this effect? Well, to explain the results, we propose an institutional mechanism that works through the weakening of labor unions. And why? Well, there's some studies in the political science literature showing that unions can influence on elections. And these organizations are historically connected with left-wing parties. So if the liberalization has affected unions negatively, perhaps it may has also affected the capacity of these organizations to support the left in the elections. And well, maybe this is how the liberalization has reduced the vote share for the left in the most affected regions. And to show that's indeed the case, we first find evidence that unions' presence declined in micro regions that faced larger tariff reductions. And we also show that the negative impact of the tariff reductions on elections is stronger in regions where there was a more meaningful union presence before the shock. So the fact is stronger in regions where this mechanism was able to act, okay? And observe that we are not saying that other mechanisms led by individual reactions are not important. We're just saying that labor unions can also be important to tell the story here, okay? And it should also be considered. Okay, so now I'll talk briefly about the liberalization in the early 90s. Before the liberalization, tariffs were very high. However, the main source of protection was a wide variety of non-tariff barriers, such as list of banned products, quantity controls, quotas, and etc. And in 1919, the Brazilian government announced a trade reform aiming to reduce protection levels and increase transparency in trade policy. So first, the government announced the abolition of quotas, administrative controls, and any other non-tariff barrier, and replaced them by import tariffs that was adjusted to reflect the same level of protection. Hence, after this period, tariffs was left as the main source of policy. It was the principal trade policy instrument, and it started to accurately reflect the level of protection faced by the national industry. Okay, so between 1991 and 1995, the government announced a gradual reduction of the import tariffs. This is considered the main phase of liberalization, okay? And well, if you compare the average tariffs in 1990 to the ones in 1995, we can observe that the magnitudes of the tariff reductions were substantial. And actually, this is one of the reasons why there are many studies using this shock to evaluate the impact of trade reform on local labor economies. Because differently from other trade policies, the tariff reductions here was substantial, okay? Another reason why many studies use this shock is because it was close to a once and for all event, which allows us to capture the cumulative effect of the trade reform on elections or on any other outcome. And finally, another important characteristic of the Brazilian liberalization is that tariff cuts was strongly negatively correlated with pre-shock tariff levels, as shown in this paper, in this figure here, okay? So here we have the changes in log of 1 plus the tariff in, between 1990 to 1995. And here we have the pre-liberalization tariffs, okay? And well, since pre-liberalization tariff levels reflect the protective structure imposed more than 30 years before the tariff cuts started, it seems hard to believe that the trade reform was somehow influenced by previous industry performance or other political issues. It seems that the sole purpose of the liberalization was to reduce protection levels and homogenize the entire tariff structure, okay? Well, and as I commented before, many studies have used this shock to evaluate the effects of the trade reform on local economies. But as far as I know, this is the first time that is used to evaluate the impacts on elections or on labor unions, okay? Okay, so now I'll explain how we classify parties in the left-right political spectrum. And we follow the methodology proposed by Cruz, and we classify a party as left-wing if it is defined as communist, socialist, or left-wing in its official manifesto. And right-wing and center parties are defined as all parties that are not left-wing, okay? It's important to say that our classification is consistent with many other classifications in the literature, and we also test the robustness of our results by changing some small parties from the left to the right, from the right to the left, okay? And here is the proposal classification. Here we have the left-wing parties, we have PT, PSOL, PCO, and in the non-left-wing parties, we have PSDB, PRONA, PMDB, okay? All right, so now about the data used in this paper. We collect official electoral data at the municipality level from the Brazilian Electoral Superior Court, and we use data on 8 presidential elections from 1989 to 2018. And we focus on the first round of vote because there was no runoffs in 1994 and 1998, but we also show the results for the runoff elections since 2002. And well, we also focus on presidential elections because the main decisions about trade policy in Brazil are taken by the federal government. So it seems more appropriated to use presidential elections to evaluate the impacts of the reform, of the trade reform on voters' behavior, okay? Tariff data come from Cumeron, who reports nominal import tariffs at the 2-digit SIC, and we also collect several socio-demographic variables at the micro-regional level from the 1991 Brazilian demographic census. And we use these variables to construct some controls at the baseline. I'll talk more about this control later, okay? Okay, so now I'm going to explain how we construct the variable that captures the impact of the tariff reduction on each microregion. We call this variable regional tariff reduction, and it's constructed as a weighted average of the changes in tariffs in each industry from 1990 to 1995, actually using the change in log of 1 plus the tariff, okay, weighted by beta. And beta captures the importance of industry I to region R in terms of work. To understand better this weight, we have that lambda is the fraction of regional labor allocated to industry I, and phi is the cost share of non-labor factors. So 1 divided by phi captured the importance of labor factors to industry I, and lambda captures the size of this industry to region R, okay? So lambda multiplied by 1 by phi captures the importance of industry I to region R. And the idea behind the regional tariff reduction is that we consider that the region is more affected by the liberalization if tariff reductions were larger in its most important industries. Okay, so to compare the evolution in the vote share for the left in regions facing larger tariff reduction to those facing smaller reductions, we estimate the following equation, and we estimated for each election year T between 1994 and 2018. And here the dependent variable is the difference in the vote share for the left between year T in 1989. Alpha are state fixed effects, X is a vector of pre-liberalization socio-demographic controls, and here we include the share of white, female, share of households in urban situation, the Gini index, okay? And in this equation, in all other regression in this paper, we cluster standard errors at the meso-regional level. Okay, so this figure here plots the estimated coefficients for the regional tariff reductions at each year, each election year, okay? And we can observe that the coefficients are negative and statistically significant at the 5% significance level, indicating that regions facing larger tariff reductions experienced a reduction in support for the left-wing candidates relative to the less affected regions. Also, the coefficient seems to be stable over time, indicating that the impact on elections is permanent, okay? It affects in the short and the medium and the long run. And the magnitudes of the impact are considerable. If you consider here the coefficients in 2018, if you move a region from the 10th percentile of the regional tariff reduction to the 90th percentile, we would observe a reduction in 17 percentage points in the vote share for the left in this region, okay? Okay, so we also checked the robustness of our results for some potential confounding effects caused by some shocks after the liberalization. We show that our results are unchanged if we control for changes in tariffs after 1995 or for the privatization that occurred in the 90s. The results are also unchanged if we control for changes in exchange rates or for the Mercosur tariffs. Okay. Also, sorry. Also, we show that our result is robust if we exclude microregions with more than half of the workforce in agriculture. And the idea here is to guarantee that our results are not driven by regions where the workforce is concentrated in only one industry. And we use agriculture because it was the most important industry in 1991. I think it's still the most important industry in Brazil. Okay, and as I commented before, we show that our results are not sensitive to alternative classifications of the political parties when moving some small parties around. Okay, so as commented before, the negative effect of the liberalization on support for the left is kind of puzzling, since either the punishment of the incumbent or an ideological response to the reform should have led to an increase in the vote share for the left and not a reduction. And to explain the result, we propose an institutional mechanism that works through the weakening of labor unions. And why do we suspect that this is an important mechanism in this case? Well, because there are some studies showing that trade exposure is negatively correlated with union strength. And that relationship is particularly salient in Brazil because the trade shock has affected formal jobs negatively. And until the end of 2017, unions' main source of income was our union taxes, known as Imposto Sindical, which was mandatory for every formal employee. So if the liberalization has reduced the number of formal jobs, it has also reduced the number, the union's revenue, okay? Also, as I said before, labor unions are capable to affect on elections. Actually, Kine and Margalit showed that these organizations can not only affect on elections, but also change the political preferences of its members, okay? And well, in Brazil, labor unions and left-wing parties are historically connected as pointed by Colstat. So the idea is that the liberalization has reduced the capacity of these labor organizations to influence on elections and support the left-wing candidates. Okay, this is the idea of the mechanism that we're proposing. And well, to show that this is indeed the case, we first show that labor unions were affected by the tariff cuts. And we do it, and we show this by re-estimating this equation, but now using some proxies for the importance of unions in each region to construct the dependence variable. And we use 3 different proxies, okay? The first one is the number of employees per population between 15 and 65 years old. And the idea here is that stronger unions are bigger and then employ more people. The second proxy is the number of unions per population between 15 and 65 years old. And the idea is that in regions with more unions, unions are more influential. And the third proxy is the number of unionized workers per population between 15 and 65 years old. And the idea is that if a union has more members, it can also influence on more people. And unfortunately, we do not observe the number of unionized workers at the regional level. So we construct it as the weighted average of the number of unionized workers at the state level in this industry I and year T, weighted by the state share of formal workers employed in industry I, in this region R within state S and year T, okay? And the next 3 figures plots the estimated coefficients for the regional tariff reduction using one of these proxies to construct the dependent variable. Here we plot the estimates using the number of union employees. And well, we can observe that the coefficients are negative, statistically significant after 1996, 1997, indicating that the number of union employees reduced in the most affected regions, okay? Well, also we plot here the results for a placebo test using pre-trains on the number of union employees, okay? And we show that the regional tariff reduction is not correlated with these pre-trains, so it seems to not be concerned in this case. This figure plots the estimates using the number of unions to construct the dependent variable. Again, we observe negative coefficients, which are also statistically significant for some years, indicating that the number of disorganization has also reduced in the most affected regions, most affected by the liberalization. And finally, we plot the estimated coefficients using the number of unionized workers. As you've probably noticed, there are some missing points here because we do not observe the number of unionized workers for these years. And here we are using 1988 as the baseline and not 1989, of course, because we do not have data on 1989. But again, we observe negative coefficients, also statistically significant, which indicates that this organization has been affected negatively by the liberalization. Okay, so now we want to know whether this whether the weakening of union is the mechanism underlying the effect of the regional tariff reduction on elections. And if this were the case, then one would expect to observe a stronger negative relationship between tariff cuts and the vote share for the left in regions with at least a small presence of unions. And to do that, we look at heterogeneous effects of the regional tariff reduction on the vote share for the left, estimating this equation here. This equation is similar to the previous one, but now we include these two interactions here, okay? And we also estimate a pooled version of the equation. So we do not estimate it for each election year. We use every election year data to estimate it. And again, the dependent variable is the difference on the vote share for the left, and I-25 and I-50 are indicator variables that the microregion R is above the 2050 or the 50th percentile for each of the measures of union presence in 1989. So we're going to estimate this equation 3 times, one for each measure of union presence. Well, actually, we estimated 6 times because we also used the first round of vote and runoff elections to construct the dependent variable. Okay, and well, so what do we want to answer estimating this equation? Well, we want to know if the negative effect of the tariff cuts on the votes for the left is greater in areas where unions had a meaningful presence prior to the shock. And this table says, yes, it is. Okay, and before I explain the coefficients, I'll explain what's happening in this table. In panel A, we use the first round of vote to construct the dependent variable, and in panel B, we use the runoff elections. In the first column, we use the number of union employees per population between 15 and 65 years old to construct the indicators. In column 2, use the number of unions. In the third column, use the number of unionized workers. And well, what do we find? Except for the third column in panel A, at least one of the interactions are negative and statistically significant, giving support to our assumption that this is a channel through which tariff reduction has affected elections, okay? Also, it's important to observe that in general, the heterogeneity in the effects of the tariffs are captured by the interaction with the 2050 percentile, which indicates that what really matters is if the region has at least a small presence of unions. It does not matter if the unions are huge or medium sized. What matters is if the region has at least a small presence of unions prior to shock. Okay. And finally, it's also important to emphasize that except for the estimates in the first column in panel A and the ones in the third column in panel B, the regional tariff reduction coefficient is still negative and statistically significant, which indicates that there are probably other mechanisms behind the effect here, maybe led by individual reactions, maybe not, but that should be considered in future studies. Okay, so to conclude, what we've done in this paper, well, we evaluate the short and long run electoral consequence of the Brazilian liberalization in the 90s and investigate the role of trade unions as a potential driver of the results. And what we find, well, first we show that tariff cuts has permanently reduced the share of votes cast for left-wing candidates in the most affected regions. And we also show that the tariff cuts has also lowered trade unions' presence in the most affected regions. And finally, we show that the reductions in the votes for the left happened predominantly in areas where the unions were initially more important. Okay, well, that's it for the presentation. Thank you, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pedro. Great time. So I will start with Vladimir Carrillo. Can you please ask your questions? You posted two on the chat, or do you want me to read them? Okay, so let me read them. Should one be concerned about pre-existing differential trends in political attitudes prior to the liberalization episode? Even if there is no pre-trends employment and wages, it's not clear that this is the case for political attitudes. The other is, should the number of unionized workers be normalized by total number of workers? Otherwise, it could confound these trends with overall employment effects of the trade policy. Do you want to address them first? And then there's some people with their hands raised already.
Okay, so I'll answer the first question.
Okay.
First, unfortunately, the 1989 presidential elections was the first presidential elections in Brazil in 30 years. So it's impossible to conduct a placebo test using difference in vote share for the left before the liberalization. However, it seems that this assumption of the version of parallel trends holds for a bunch of mechanisms that could drive the effects of the regional tariff reductions on elections. Well, there are many studies that investigate the effect of Brazilian liberalization on economic outcomes. And in general, these studies show that pre-liberalization trends on these outcomes are not correlated with the regional tariff reduction. And well, as you saw, we also show that this is true for the mechanism of union's presence, okay? And moreover, we're still trying to collect data on municipality and gubernatorial elections for a period before the liberalization to conduct a placebo test. And well, I'm not sure if I should say that, but this is new even to my cultures, okay? But I received data on the number of votes cast for each party in the 1982 gubernatorial elections. And using the difference on the vote share for the left in this election with the one for presidential elections in 1989, I re-estimate our main specification, and I found a non-significant effect for the regional tariff reduction on the vote share for the left. So of course, this exercise is at least unusual since we're comparing an election for governor with presidential elections, but well, it's another piece of evidence that that supports our main justification assumption, okay? And sorry, I forgot the second question.
Second question is, should number of unionized workers be normalized by total number of workers? Otherwise, it could confound these trends with overall employment effects of the trade policy.
Okay, so, okay. We do this, okay? We also show the results. Stop to, let me return here. We also, results, here, using union employees per capita or the log of 1 plus the union employees, okay? And the results are almost the same, okay? I think this was the question, right? We should use the number of union employees per capita. And with us, and the results are similar.
So do you have non-unionized workers? Do you have on this table non-unionized workers? You don't have the...
No. Well, there are some other studies that investigate the effects on like on employment in general, okay?
Right.
Dix Carneiro and Kovac, but no. Using only known...
yeah, to break to see if like this fall that you see on unionized workers, if you see the same pattern with non-unionized or not, exactly to capture this difference.
Okay. Well, this is interesting.
Okay, we have two questions.
No, we do not do it, but...
Sorry, Pedro, we have another question from Bruno Fairman.
Okay. So, thank you, Edson. And Thank you, Pedro. It was a great presentation. I really like the paper. I have just one small point. At some point, I believe you mentioned that you're focusing on the presidential election because the trade policy was a federal decision. And I would understand that if you're focusing on the mechanism that maybe you originally thought that that people will try to vote according to what the trade policy, how the trade policy affect them. But at the end, like the main conclusion of the paper is that the main mechanism is something totally different, and that would not have this specificity of being something that you would expect to affect presidential elections and not the regional ones. So I think it will be interesting to add the information on the regional elections. And actually, if you don't find much differences, then this could be an indication that the mechanism that you are proposing here is actually much more relevant than the other mechanisms, like, okay, the trade policy may affect how I see the government that introduced this policy.
Yeah, you're right, but the problem is that we do not have data on these elections, on sped elections or gubernatorial for a period before the liberalization. So it's impossible to conduct the same analysis. Okay, we're still trying to collect this data. Okay, because I agree with you. I think it's important to know what happens in these elections too. But unfortunately, we don't have this data yet.
Yeah, I think even if you don't have the pre-data on the regional election, maybe you can try to check whether the pre-presidential election will be a good proxy for that, for the pre-period. I think it will be an interesting exercise.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, a good idea, yeah.
Enrique?
I'll try it.
Enrique Rodriguez has a question.
Hi, Pedro. Wonderful presentation. I have like two or three questions. The first one is, if you're thinking about that unions are the mechanism, shouldn't we expect that the effect on parties should be different? So I'm thinking about, for example, PT is much more related with unions, and its foundation is much more related to unions than, for example, PDT or even PSB. So one thing that I would like to know is if you try to do something like that and to see which parties are driving your results, because if it's PDT, maybe it's not unions. The second question is about it's not a question exactly, but you have like a gubernatorial election data, as far as I could listen you well. And maybe one thing that you should do, rather than using the difference between the results in 1982 to 1989, is to have the results for 1982 and interact them with like a time trend. So you have different trends for different places based on political outcomes in 1982. And if you have done so, tell us. And the last question, it relates with what Bruno said about regional elections. I don't think that you have like electoral margins, but you may have the mayor. You may know the mayor and his party affiliation. So maybe you could use that and like use the probability of having a left-wing mayor. Or have you tried to do something like that? That's the
okay.
question.
Okay. So, well, starting for the first, answer the first question. Well, we do some exercise like to investigate which parties are the ones driving the effect, and it's I think you maybe you're right. I think that the effect is stronger when we look for PT, PSOL, PCO. Okay, so but well, I think it would be interesting to do more of these exercises. Okay, about the gubernatorial data, well. The problem is that I received this data yesterday. Okay, so I didn't have time to explore it well. So don't think that I did was this exercise using the difference in vote share in 1982 to the one in 1989. Okay, and about the mayor, well, actually, this is exactly what we are trying to do. But the problem is that it's not that easy to get information on which party was the mayor in 1989 or previous, like 1985, 19, like it's probably this data is available somewhere, but we're trying still trying to get it. Okay, but it's exactly what we're trying to do now.
All right, Vitor has a question.
Yes, I was unmuting myself. First of all, thank you for the presentation, Pedro. It was really great. The paper is super interesting. I have a small question relating your paper with Rafael's paper. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, Rafael's paper, they find an effect on trade liberalization on employment and wages. And this, at least for me, is important because I wasn't able to see your control variables because it was really quick. And my main concern is that trade liberalization might has an impact on employment levels, and employment levels might have an impact on the vote share of the left, specifically if the impacted sectors are, for example, manufacture, that may influence the vote share of the left. And it is a result related to unions too, in some sense, but I'm not sure how you controlled for this possible effect of employment on vote share.
Okay, if I'm not sure if I understand well, but well, you're saying that since the there's an impact on wages or impact on the employment, we should observe, in my opinion, we should observe an increase in the vote share for the left, right? So actually, that's why our result is puzzling. So, okay, like people are losing jobs, so they want to support the left-wing candidates, okay? Because they are identified with the labor movement. I'm not sure if this is.
I guess the question is similar to Chico's point earlier about like how can you show the trends for unionized workers versus non-unionized workers. I think that would clarify this point. Yeah, I think that would be the by the way, I have a question on related to this point, which is Rodrigo, with his co-authors in other papers, in another paper, shows that trade liberalization had at least a temporary effect on crime. And then there's this idea, at least in the US, and if I remember correctly, at least in the 90s in Brazil, there was this idea of the left-wing parties are not so law and order. And so I wonder if the decrease in the shares for the left is also related to that. So I guess like my question is, if you were to do a back of the envelope calculation to understand what is the percentage of the reduction in the vote shares for the left can be explained by the decrease in unionization versus other channels like crime.
Okay. Yeah, well, with thoughts about crime as a potential mechanism, but the problem is, as you said, crime has the impact in crime is in the short run, but what we observe on elections in the long run, okay, it seems to be permanent. So that's why we don't think that this is a channel, or it may be important in like in the first elections, maybe, but we don't think that this is like this would explain all the fact that we find here. Okay, but yeah, it's important. I think it would be interesting to verify if crime is affecting the elections in 1994 or 1998.
Yeah. Vitor, go ahead.
Can I jump in very quickly? Can I jump in very quickly
Yeah,
just to, yeah, no, because of this discussion as well of employment, right? So the result, as I understand the result from the literature, from the more labor literature, is that, I mean, in the medium run effect on employment is to a great extent on formal employment, right? And then the long run recovery on employment is actually mostly informal, right? So in terms of overall employment, I think there is this argument that Pedro made that actually that's more or less the argument from the US and European literature. And that's what is puzzling about our results. But also in terms of long run effects, employment actually comes back, right? So it cannot be just an issue of overall employment. The fact that it may be related to formal employment by itself, it's part of the mechanism, because actually the union tax was mechanically related to formal employment. So that's actually also part of this story, right? So I think in terms of crime, there is the issue of the temporary effect. In terms of employment, also there is the issue of temporary effect. But just to highlight one thing that Pedro said, I mean, these things cannot be playing out, right? We cannot control for these things because they're endogenous to the shock. So they would all be bad controls, right? It's just in some sense that it's given these patterns, the political response is very puzzling and very different from everything that is documented elsewhere. And actually, there is one plausible mechanism that probably is contributing to that. So just, I mean, taking the foot a little off the accelerator in that sense. I mean, other things can be going on, and we cannot rule that out, right? Just, but
yeah, it would be interesting to know, like, what is the extent to which the union story explained the decreasing vote shares, right? So, like, if you can say it's 50, 60, 70% of the story, but go ahead.
No, exactly. Relate to this, like maybe you can use like a proper, like actual mediation analysis to look at like what's the effect of unionized workers, informal jobs or ununionized jobs, exactly to decompose to see, look, what I'm seeing this effect on the left wing is exactly 60% comes from unionized workers. And as Rodrigo said, like on the long run, like informal, probably ununionized workers bounce back. So the mechanism should be through this unionized.
Yeah, let me just add to that. I think it's a very interesting paper, and there's this mechanical effect coming from union taxes. But you know, like there's a lot of things about unions and their relationship with political parties as well. But there's a lot of things about unions that, you know, like you're not exploring enough so far. For instance, the role of central unions. This changed a lot over time. Like after 2006, they started collecting taxes as well. But in particular, this point about the relationship of these parties with informal workers, I think it's very important. It's very important. It's very contemporary, right? The current discussion about why PT is losing in a lot of places that used to have more votes is about they're not being able to connect to informal workers, this new middle class. And just to complement my previous point about the political parties, in the line that Henrique was proposing, you also have a more continuous difference, I mean, left-wing tendencies across parties, right? So it's not like a binary thing, like a left-wing party and a non-left-wing party. So maybe you could explore this a little bit more.
Okay, thank you.
Vitor, you had a question, or it was just I saw?
No, Rodrigo clarified that. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thanks. There was just one comment in the chat by Enrique. I have a feeling that party affiliation of mayors can be found for particular states in an easier way than others, but I'm not completely sure about it. One way to check this is going to the website of Tribunais Regionais Eleitorais and check if you have something better than TSE.
Yeah, okay.
Yes,
We've done this. Yeah. We found this information for, I think, 9 states. But thank you.
Any other questions? All right, so let's give a round of virtual applause to Pedro and co-authors for this great presentation. Great. So that concludes this this session, and I guess Gustavo, Francisco, and I would talk at some point, or even now, I don't know. But thank you very much for all the presenters, the 2 presenters and the co-authors, and all the audience for engaging with interesting questions. And hopefully you enjoy the rest of the conference. Gustavo, do you want to stick around, or Ashiko? Like,
do you want me to send a Zoom link for us?
Okay.
I'll send here on the chat.
Okay. Can you send me on the email as well, or?
Oh, I sent here on the private chat.
Oh, sure.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Edson, for coordinating the session.
Because I don't know if the at noon this.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'll open that right now then.
Bye. Congrats, Pedro.
Right.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Pedro. Very good presentation. Congratulations, Nicholas, as well.
Obrigado, Edson. Obrigado, Francisco, Pedro, Gustavo. Eu vou estar encerrando a sala aqui, tudo bem?
Tá bom, então.
Peraí, deixa eu só pegar aqui.
Só pega o link aí.
Tá.
Vou fechar aqui.
Peguei. Valeu.
Perfeito. Vou encerrar aqui e até a próxima, pessoal. Bom dia para vocês.
Obrigado.